Welcome everybody, dear friends. We now continue our Internet Governance Forum. We have next panel, which is really quite interesting because it is about a very hot topic for the online space, not only in Georgia, but also elsewhere. And now we are going to consider the Georgian reality. First of all, the topic is the misinformation challenges in Georgia's internet space. And today we have four participants of this panel. My name is Mamuka Andruladze. I will be the moderator. First of all, I would like to present Ms. Eka Sepashvili, the Deputy Chairperson of the Committee of Defense and Security of the Parliament of Georgia, Ms. Tamar Kinsurashvili, Executive Director of the Media Development Fund, Eto Buziashvili, the DFR Lamp Association researcher, and Ms. Eter Turadze, the Chief Editor of the newspaper Batume Lebi. So you know that we are here, part of the guests, together with the hosts and organizers, and we have, of course, online participants. I would like to start with Ms. Eka. As I already mentioned, the misinformation that is quite serious challenge, really very relevant problem, and not in our country only, but globally, so-called fake news, because this terminology maybe is not very pleasant. However, that is widely recognized, the term. The topic is very interesting. We have very interesting experts here. And maybe a few minutes you will speak how you see this problem. First and foremost, importance of this problem and what type of challenge it is for our country to have the fake news. Thank you very much. Yeah, topic is really very important. And it is also very nice that you put it in your agenda because that is the problem for the Georgia society and so-called the misinformation. I would like to give the look from the two perspectives. One is the sort of weapon, the tool used in the hybrid war against countries' security, safety, and on the other hand, it is used in our reality as a political tool when they have the political debates. And often the misinformation, misleading information, their dissemination is really are very important. So these are the two important. These are two important elements which I would like to identify here. And I think that in this context, Parliament takes very important role because our country is a parliamentary republic and it has its very special role and function in assessing the existing situation in the country, in identifying the policy of the development. And our committee started working in this direction. That is against propaganda, mispropaganda, against the fake news, against the misinformation and disinformation. We first of all would like to hear from the state agencies what type of the challenges they see, what type of the problems are identified first and foremost with regard of the relevant legislation. You mentioned quite rightly that it's a problem in our country. Many other countries also are facing this same problem. One of the important steps here can be first and foremost identification of the legal framework. And another issue that is the development of the media literacy. Uh, also from the side of the journalists, from the media outlets, we really need the coordinated action in order to develop their internal standards, and while having the internal standards, not to violate them and not to encourage the dissemination of the fake news. Quite often, maybe even unwittingly, they disseminate this type of information because they make the reference to some respondents, interviewees, and then they just multiply the fake news. Or sometimes they are inviting sort of experts, and the media representatives call them experts, while their expert knowledge may be quite doubtful. Therefore, when it comes to the expert, not only in this field but elsewhere, is a person who has some experience in the particular field, knows the legislation of the particular field, etc., and not as it is in our reality. In order to fight against the misinformation and the fake news, even the previous parliament started the special work. There was a thematic inquiry. We also elaborated some recommendations, and in order to implement those recommendations, also within the frame of our committee, we now start very active, I'd say, the fighting against the misinformation and the fake news. Let me draw your attention to one short information. I know that you are very much limited in time. However, this is quite important information, which I the cross the, which I they found just recently. There is one of the international organizations which is investigating whether the country is resilient against the misinformation, and they make the assessment with regard to three components. First is the attitude of the society, whether the society is acceptable of it. The next is the issue of the legitimacy, whether the legal frame in fact encourages or discourages dissemination of the fake news. Also, next element is media, digital media, and their impact on the fake news. And let me tell you that if we take into account assessment of that international organization, we are behind of the resilience. So may, maybe you tell us about the legal base. You know, it is quite difficult to have the regulation, I mean the legal framework, because on the one hand, we have the freedom of speech, and the freedom of speech shall be secured. And the ruling party, of course, does it best in order not to have this some political persecution or any other wrongdoings or the non-democratic steps which in fact impede the democratic development. Now in the parliament we initiated new law that is the prohibition of restriction of the hate language in the pre-election campaign, also in the advertising during the pre-election campaign, etc. So you know that we are witnessing gross violation of the freedom of speech as well as the fake news dissemination. Thank you very much. I will stop here. as far as I understand, Parliament is going to make decisive steps with regard of fighting against misinformation and fake news. And you also plan to review the legislation. Have you already investigated the exams of the foreign countries? Yes, yes, we have done it. However, we are not going to copy them down. They just directly. We need to introduce new practice, but it should be in compliance with Georgian reality in order to avoid the formal approach to it. So, I mean, now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Tamar Gitsulashvili, Executive Director of the Media Development Fund, and her organization every day tries just to explain to the society the specific issues to see this problem. Thank you very much, Mamuka. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I also agree with Mamuka that we have two-dimensional problem in our country. First of all, this is the, let's say, not a friendly countries. The propaganda, the creation of the conflicts on the ethnic, on the religious basis, and it is not done in a way of the political advertisement. That is the topic of the internal policy of the confrontation, and another is internal problem related to the political class, existence of the different actors. Of course, misinformation and the fake news also existed before the 21st century. However, development of the technologies made the society more vulnerable. Therefore, hybrid war is number one enemy for the occupied country because on the territory of Georgia today we have the tanks, the armament of the foreign country. Therefore, media here as the institute has to play the greater role. I think that the hybrid challenge of Kremlin as well as some this sort of hybrid operations, including the hate speech, hate language, etc., because we've seen it on July 5. One of the platforms which is related to the informational policy of the non-friendly country, there, they were the initiators of burning the EU flags. Also, more than 50 journalists were beaten and attacked, and these cases are not well investigated. Therefore, we need to prioritize the issues. It doesn't mean that we have the immunity against this type of the approach. If the goal is just to devastate the critical approaches, it's a critical challenge because in the democratic country we need effective self-regulation, and we just welcome if the government is going to make the positive steps in this direction. We have the good experience of Baltic countries against the hybrid challenges. So it is welcome. It would be welcoming if the previous parliament continue working on the document that was under the development, but afterwards we have not had any continuation of this process. And if there is any changes introduced to the legislation, it would be very good to take into account recommendations by ECRI not to finance the media outlets which are breeding the hate language. Here we can draw your attention to the examples of for instance, the sort of campaigns like during the COVID-19. If we have the problem when more than 10,000 people died due to the COVID-19, there was some encouragement for the anti-vaxxers. Media literacy is another way for the solution. We also work in this direction, and it would be good if these issues will be integrated in the school curricula. Here we need to elaborate good tools. The prohibition is not the only solution because we need the people to filter some ideas in their mind, and we need the line process. In the social media, we see how this platform is well used even for anti the vaccination campaign. And another issue, quite often the fertile soil is created by the information vacuum because the society cannot receive enough information. We of course need the society to be reflective to to the problems. Eto, I would like now to give the floor to you. I know that your organization is very actively involved in investigating the existing problems. How do you see this problem? How hot this problem is? How serious, how complex it is? And it has been already mentioned that the problem is really serious. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Yes, I agree with all of the participants. I was questioned many times. Some fake news, some other misleading information, which is expressed in online, how it goes to the physical space. The July 5 was one of the clear, I would say, the demonstration when the misinformation, as well as the some the call for the forcible measures had the echo. It was not, by the way, planned one day. That was disinformation, misinformation against the Western world, and it was already in the brain of our society. And some groups had the possibility to be violent against the Western style activists. Of course, we observe the society, we see how Georgia's informational space is being transformed. And here we can identify two directions. First is the attempt of the Russian Federation to interfere in the elections. And we, by the way, published the research how Kremlin, using media, social platforms, their different actors to interfere in the elections of Georgia. How it was demonstrated. Okay, first of all, it was from Sputnik News Front, that is online platform. It is not media; they are just the propagandists, the platforms, and they were well. They were acting well, coordinating the Facebook posts, etc., and tried to breed some anti-Western narratives. And that was to have some impact on the choice. In addition, there were cyber attacks, three cyber attacks followed with the informational campaign. One was about the shutting down 15,000 websites, including the president's website, as well as some media outlets, and the investigation conducted by US and the UK that was managed from Moscow. Another cyber attack was against the Ministry of Health and the Lugar laboratory, as a result of which they falsified the document. And today, when so many anti-vaxxer type the news is disseminated, that played quite an important role. Then was the third cyber attack when they said that the personal data of the four Georgian citizens were easily accessible. Of course, that is the attempt to break the chaotic situation because I, as a just ordinary citizen of Georgia, can think that, yeah, it's so easy to get the access to the confidential information. We also have to underline ultra rightist groups, and often they find the support from the Russian Federation or from the actors which are ruled and managed from the Russian Federation. They can be so-called experts, or they can be the political, let's say, subjects. And because we witnessed campaigns against Turkey, against Azerbaijan, because they would like to shift the attention of the society from the Russian Federation and target Azerbaijan or Turkey. So that is quite threatening tendency, quite dangerous. And also we have new trend that is anti-Chinese messages which are disseminated now in our media space. So China is new space. Yes, so, there are some websites where the Chinese Communist Party is well demonstrated, and at the same time they discredit the administration of Biden. Okay, thank you very much. And now I would like to ask Ms. Atta. Will she's in online and she's the chief editor of Batumelebi. And I would like to ask her how they see this challenge, because on the side of the panelists, we heard that there's a disinformation through media and from the media. And also there are some questions with regard to of their professionalism. How you see this problem? Because quite often we've heard about your media that it is used for propaganda. So please, the floor is yours. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about the misinformation and fake news. Of course, this challenge is of a multifold. However, I will be speaking more about the media literacy. What is this challenge? What we are speaking about, and when it comes to this challenge, it is quite difficult to tackle it, to address it, because that is a very big flaw. And I think that none of the media outlets can fight against it, because they may not have so much resources, either financial or human resources, to address this problem. And what we see is we cannot address this problem. And what we have to do? Okay, first and foremost, the trust level of the trust to media is devastating, and we are face to face with the very strong attack. It has been already mentioned that mass media is polarized in our country. And yes, I agree with this statement. I am from that very few media outlets which does not represent any side. It is in the center and tries to provide information to the society. That is the only objective of our media outlet. But regardless of this situation, often we are the objects of fake news, tech, etc., etc. So, why? Why the situation is so grave now? And I'll try to explain it. The situation has been changed after June. The situation is even graver now. I am in the journalism for a quite a lengthy period of time. Even when Aslan Bashidze was in Nigeria, since that time I've been working there. And today, when we go to the field for working, I always warn the journalists to be very careful, not to identify themselves as a journalist, just to try, because we have increased aggression against the journalists. For instance, under the motivation that we live within the environment of polarized media, that, that, that is our fault and we have to be punished. So I don't remember this type of the background. Before we had the practice when we used to say the journalist just identify yourself when when some aggression comes, you explain that you are journalist, say that you are reporter, but it must be also quite easily recognizable from the appearance, badges, etc. But no, we have different challenge. We want them, please try not to be identifiable. Just try to avoid identification yourself as a journalist if you are in the places of some mass gathering, etc. Why? Why it happens? Even we are in the region, the domino effect which we had after June 5, it also approached Ajara, and it will have its impact for a longer period of time, unfortunately. When it comes to the evaluation of this process, I would say that even we have quite a big devastating environment. Today, we do not have any results about the investigation. Why this investigation is procrastinated? Why that, let's say, the Lexo Lashkarava's death is not well investigated. You remember that Minister of Interior disseminated the statement with regard of overdosing. However, we all know that some so-called reputational the killing or association or let's say death, that is the also somehow the result of the fake news, misinformation, where we see the participation of the institutions which shall fight against misinformation, and we are facing just a contrary. If we review the entire picture, why it was abbreviated, I would like to remind you that after the death of Nexo Lashkarava, we wanted to have the special demonstration in Tbilisi. One of the highest persons said that those participants allegedly asked the detention of the patriarch. And of course, it was damageable, and it is absolutely impossible from the side of the high level officials to disseminate this type of the fake news. It creates aggression, it is devastating the trust to the institutions, and it may not bring any good for anybody. So I will finish here, and if you have any questions to me, I will answer it with a great pleasure. The major idea of this Internet Governance Forum is that different interested fields, non-governmental organizations, media, and the others, they put themselves together and they speak where we are on the world map. Of course, we knew what would be talked about, but of course, we had no idea about the concrete statements. You know, today we have heard about about the 5 June, somebody says June, somebody July, I'm sorry. I wonder what type of steps you made as the government. Are those steps effective in order to address the misinformation and the fake news? And as you already stated about the legislation, of course, that is very sensitive issue, the causing different type of the considerations in our country. So what is going on today? Whether the measures adopted by the government that are enough? Do you have any linkage between the 5 July events and the further developments? And what do you plan with regard of the coordination in order to confront against this misinformation and fake news? Thank you very much. I just wanted to interfere with regard of these particular issues. How I see when it comes to the 5th July, that is very bad demonstration of the outcomes or aftermath of the fake news and misinformation disseminated by the media. Of course, we condemn any forcible measures, any coercion, and of course, the investigation started and the perpetrators will be punished. However, we have to agree that that is the expression of the hate, of the propaganda, which is in fact quite easily recognizable in our society. So that hate was sort of, let's say, the burst in our society, and we witnessed the victims among the journalists, even those who had no touch at all to the issue. Of course, the media outlets shall strengthen their capacity. They have to observe the common standards. And what I mean here, a few months ago, a National Commission of Communication ordered the, I don't remember the name of the international organization. They conducted the study of the channels, the TV channels that was about the bias among among the channels, and it was conducted by the international organization. And they identified that the most objective information was the broadcasting by the public broadcaster, then Rustavi too. But with regard of the bias, we had sort of leaders, as we call the so-called party TV channels, Pirveli, Tavari, and Formula. So the measures which we can take against the fake news and misinformation, which is one of the forms of the fake news, it would be very good, for instance, that in parallel to the development of the internet system, to encourage the transparency of the media outlets. What do you mean under the transparency of the media sources? So the so-called the party channels, which we call, or say non-partisans or partisans, because they express let's say, the biased approaches. Of course, it is not the criminal, but when the journalist or the TV channel has the claim that they are objective, but at the same time, quite latently, they protect the interests of a certain political party, it is absolutely unacceptable. And, we need the neutral approaches and the transparency. Only transparency is not enough because the liability of the information, as well as the banning the hate language, it is really very important because all of them together they breeds very strict confrontation between the sides, between the parties. Um, When it comes to the social network, we see that hate language, if you go through and maybe also have the touch with the most, the popular Facebook, yes, yes. So if there is one post from the ruling party, the opposite party is abusing, including some personal abuse, and insult. And if the post is from the opposition, another party, another side, the how the legislation can solve this problem. You said that international organization conducted the study. I don't remember very well. Somebody speaks without microphone. I cannot hear her. Yes, there was Imedi, which had the highest, let's say, rank with regard of the bias. Even the ranking was made there. You know, when we know who stands behind of the channel, it is quite easy to recognize them. No one tries to cover it. Unfortunately, now we spend a lot of time on the internal issues. We need better consolidated, the consolidated approach. Specifically, when it comes to the infodemia, often we do not have enough communication and we do not have the good approaches for the dissemination of information. Let me remind you that when Nexo Lashkarava died, the first day, the specific page was created, and it, by the way, they published the personal data of Nexo Lashkarava. Nexo Lashkarava's personal data would not be demonstrated without the involvement of the state agencies. It is our interest to have high quality media. And here maybe we have to encourage self-regulation of the media. There is not a problem of the legislation. Problem is maybe the wrong practice because control is not sufficient. Ms. Tamar, in fact, you just repeated what I have already said. Um, because we know that propaganda, international propaganda, whether this is coordinated or not. You know, finally, this hate language have, by the way, this threat of the hybrid war. It may become one of the elements of the hybrid war. It's one of the reflections of it. If we have let's say, some confrontation inside of the country, it can be used by the confronting parties. When it comes to the legislation, here we need to find a very careful consensus because under Article 17 of the Constitution of Georgia, it is prohibited to persecute the people for on the basis of the expression, speech, etc. So, free expression, freedom of speech may not be restricted in the democratic society. On the other hand, defamation, the hate language, they must be put within the legislative framework. Therefore, we have the hope on the inclusive involvement of the civil society. And we do hope that it would be possible to find the golden mean in order to uh, bring down to the minimum the hybrid threats, which is about the fake news. Of course, I cannot extricate myself from that hate language because it's one of the elements of the hybrid war. Miss Tamar, you maybe 1 minute to you and a few minutes to you. I see the problem here because as the representative of the government can see the problem, the freedom of expression. I would say that Georgia has one of the excellent legislations in the world where the highest standard of the freedom of speech or human rights are observed. The people who have the special intention to disseminate the fake news, if the person, the Georgian in Turkey was the killed for, let's say, some the burglary, but in fact, the person was not Georgian national at all. That was the fake news. Here we need to be consolidated. However, it will not be easy to consolidate all of the organizations because whatever has been already evaluated as the most the progressive legislation, we even can just worsen it, not improve it. That's why maybe it's better to keep it as it is. But on the other hand, we need to fight against the chaotic situation in the news. Because in this chaotic situation, only the enemy can take the benefit. If I can add here, the Miss Eka talked about the regulation. I agree with Tamar that Georgia has the law on the freedom of expression, and it is the most liberal law. And we, by the way, are a little bit afraid that any intervention may just worsen the media legislation of our country. So we need a regulation of some defamation, the, maybe some feelings, religious feelings, etc. I think that it must be the subject of the self-regulation among the journalists, and the country should regulate other type of the challenges. When it comes to the Facebook, dissemination of misinformation and the fake news, of course, you cannot fight against it through the legislation. Therefore, in online, in social media, the situation will be the same. It is not easy to change it. And afterwards, the changes of the law will be only reflected against media and not against social media. So that's why I think that it must be the subject of the self-regulation or the subordinated to the media standards. Eto wanted to start just a few ideas. The Eka mentioned about the space of the legislative spaces, sharing over the practice of other countries, which countries you meant here. At the same time, we have to take into account that in those countries, democratic institutions are functioning in the democratic environment. And when we have in our country so fragile democracy, and in some of the reports and some of the observers already refer to the downfall of Georgia's democracy, I think we have to pay attention also to the current situation. You mentioned that your committee is going to invite the state agency and then said that inclusiveness is very important. Maybe you mean the involvement of media and NGO or the civil society organizations, because here, you know, it is related to the democracy and democratic development of our country. The non-NGOs as well as the SCOs quite often express their readiness to have this dialogue. When it comes to the cooperation, over the recent years, we developed many good studies, inquiries, as well as the researchers, and we warned not only the Georgian society, but also the others that we are witnessing some confrontation, attempt of the interference from this side of the Russian Federation. And here, cooperation is really very important because we, by the way, develop those researches long before the problems appear. And my last idea, that is about the fake news coming from the Russian Federation. First of all, this is the issue related to the national security, economic pressure. You mentioned the hybrid war. So that is the tool of the Russian Federation just to break the Georgian society from the inside. And here we need the concentration of all of us together. So, Ms. Eka, you are the representative from the government of Georgia. That's why most of the questions are addressed to you. And maybe from my side, I just would like to raise one question. When it comes to the legislation of the founding countries, would you please to say just one example about the misinformation legislation against fake news, etc.? I was very attentive to the speakers, and I have the impression that we all are on the same platform. We all have the same approaches, and we are going to solve this problem using the same tools. You have already mentioned that we are going to follow this process through the inclusive forms and the means. And of course, not only with the non-governmental organizations, media outlets, but any actors and stakeholders involved in this particular field. This is the issue covering each and every layer of the society. That's why I mentioned that whatever changes or amendments are made and introduced, we want them to be active, to be functional, and not to remain on a paper. At the same time, let me underline that when we plan some changes in this direction, that we are going to introduce some tough regulations. Not at all. The process will show. You mentioned that it would be good just to, let's say, put this issue for the decision on the media, so-called self-regulation. But on our side, we can help them, even in the self-organization, self-censorship, etc. When it comes to the changes of the legislation, you know that non-governmental organizations prepared the research, it's a so-called index of resilience. And one of the component of this index is the legal, the framework and institutional resilience. And here the Visegrad countries have been considered as well as the countries of the Eastern Partnership. And the legal framework is evaluated based on some methodology. Four is the highest score here. And according to that score, let me explain what type of situation we have today. The Georgia doesn't have the good situation with regard to the misinformation and the fake news. So if we say that our legislation, the best one, and doesn't require any changes, I would refrain myself from making this type of these statements. I also cannot say the single way that we definitely need some changes. With regard of the resilience from the side of Armenia, it's 1.1, Azerbaijan 1.2, Czech Republic 1.0, Georgia 0.9, Ukraine 1.4, Slovakia 1.5, the Hungary 1.9, Azerbaijan is 1.2. It is the disinformation and the resilience. Yeah, I understand why find it's slightly cynical. Of course, we may not know beforehand what would be the result. However, I can say that it will be conducted in a most inclusive manner through the participation of media outlets and non-governmental organizations. And thank you very much that you offer your expert knowledge. You already mentioned the very good example of one of the countries. So I would like to share with you that the practice or best practice of any country may not be introduced directly or copied down in our country. We have to take into account the national context. I myself am the economist, the specialist of the international economy, and even in economy, we cannot copy down just the opposite. National peculiarities, in fact, show the challenges and they must be taken into account while introducing them.
Thank you very much, Eka, and many thanks to to the to all the panelists, Ms. Eter, and we're glad to discuss to have the chance to discuss the problem. Uh, it's good that the importance of cooperation has been emphasized, and importance of continuing cooperation. Thanks again, and we received some questions through the chat. Natalia from the Council of Europe will tell us about the questions, and then we'll sum up some of this. So let's take the questions now. Just two questions here. Two questions. Here's the first one. Are any sanctions for disinformation, misinformation, and what sanctions are those? Those sanctions. And another question is about why is it that nobody gets interested is that the major internet providers are spreading Russian channels in Georgia, broadcasting Russian channels. So first one was whether there's any sanction for misinformation. Our legislation envisages sanctions for intended misinformation. It's the hard thing, though, to prove this intention. You see that the misinformation was spread on purpose. Now, when it comes to resilience, to resistibility, resistibility is based on the applicable standards, and the standards are considered liberal. So we work with the Facebook myth detector and fact check. We are now Facebook's partner to tackle misinformation. This was after Russia intervened in U.S. Internal businesses. Two of our organizations within the partnership with Facebook what we do is we don't delete the posts. What we do is just we provide the correct information to the public, and Facebook will, how to say, restrict restrict dissemination if they continue to spread misinformation. For example, anti-vaccination people are quite active right now. There are groups. You have groups on Facebook who are affiliated with both the ruling party and the opposition. They have just different resources. So this mechanism of Facebook has been operational in Georgia, and then there's also Ed Library, and you can see which country is managing the book and how much money they're spending on ads. So there's some progress in this regard. Many thanks. What was the second question? Why nobody gets interested in ISPs broadcasting Russian television? Because the internet is a global platform, and so we should be rather investing more in media literacy so that they can filter themselves. When you create a mechanism where assessment is dependent on somebody's subjective judgment, you see, we are four people here and everybody has different views, and so it's hard to impose such a standard. Some countries have well-established court jurisprudence, and hate language is punishable by criminal law, but here it's interpreted in a different way. For example, if a religious leader, publishes a post, can become a basis to call somebody to the prosecution, or to be summoned for somebody to be summoned to the prosecution office. So this is especially an acute problem in the countries of the transitional democracy. Yes, thank you. Thanks for that. Mariam will now summarize this discussion. Thank you. Many thanks to the panelists. I think this panel was interesting, and we discussed some of the important issues. Something I'd like to emphasize is we agree there's a problem. The problem is called misinformation. Issue, the topic of our panel. We also discussed the 5th of July events, how misinformation is spread and is reflected in the actual life. We discussed this as well. There are things we need to work on, and it's good that everybody agrees to that. The panelists said they're ready to engage in the process. Unfortunately, we may have different discrepancies in views of how the problem should be tackled. Non-governmental organizations insist on media literacy and self-regulation mechanisms as ways for combating misinformation. However, we hear also propositions about regulating this issue. In particular, sometimes when we encounter a problem, we start talking about more rules, need for more rules, need for more constraints, and limitation of the freedom of speech. So what we can agree is that we need to talk about these issues, and it's not specified how we're going to do this. Most importantly, all the participants once again want to have reassured their wish to engage in the discussion. Would also like to be engaged as a self-regulation body and as a supporter of freedom of speech. Our organization, will be thinking about how to reinforce self-regulation, how to fight misinformation through self-regulation. Thank you very much. This topic itself is extremely important, but the format, we're restricted by the format. Many thanks to the panelists. and I wish other participants a fruitful discussion. Have a good day.